Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives. Debts, jobs, incomes, our own, those of our kids. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I hope that that has prepared me adequately to present these weekly economic updates to give us more of an insight into what's happening in the economy around us. I want to start with a remarkable story about the largest insurance company in Great Britain by the name of Aviva. And it's a company well known to the British people as its largest insurance company. And it did something recently for its 16,000 employees that might be interesting to folks around the world, and particularly here in the United States. Here's what the British insurance company offers all of these 16,000 employees. Every new set of parents will be given the exact same amount of paid leave after the arrival of a child. That is, both the father and the mother, or, as you'll see in a minute, both of the parents, whatever their gender and sexual orientation. Aviva offers all of its employees 26 weeks, that's half a year, on full basic salary, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. The policy applies to parents who have given birth, or who have adopted a child, or who have chosen surrogacy, that is, when you have someone else carry your embryo, your child, to term. Now, why is this interesting besides a remarkable decision by a corporation to be generous to its own employees to a remarkable extent? The United States is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't guarantee any paid maternity leave. It's not the law in this country, as it is in many other developed countries, that there must be some paid leave, at least for the mother. But here we see half a year, which is quite a bit, and for both parents if they choose to use it. What's the risk to the company from doing it, which is what you hear about quite often? Well, one risk, if you like, is that other insurance companies that compete with Aviva will not afford this benefit to their workers, and that might make them some extra profit, and that they might then outcompete Aviva because it is incurring the expense. These kinds of arguments are really in the nature of advertising. They're not serious arguments. Let me explain. Whatever the effect might be of the competitive advantage to a company that doesn't do it, let's take a look at the other side of the ledger. A company that offers benefits like that will have much more loyal employees. They're much more likely to stay there in hopes of using that benefit when and if they have children. They will feel a sense of gratitude to the company for having allowed them to be really close parents to their children in the first half year of the child's life. In other words, there'll be less turnover at a company like Aviva than there will be at a company that doesn't offer that. You'd have to weigh the positive effect on Aviva's profits from that against any negative effects from the cost to the company of doing it, something which ought to be taken into account. You might also discover that if in the first half year parents are learning, particularly if it's a first child, how to cope with the ups and downs, the health problems, and so on of a baby, that you will not suffer the absences you will otherwise have had because the parents are on leave. By the time they come back, they're more used to the ups and downs of childcare and will be less likely to be interrupting their work days, and on and on and on. You'd have to see it. You might also investigate the mental health, the security of the relationship between the parents if they've had time to bond with their child. It's particularly interesting that in the United States, which makes more of a commitment to quote-unquote family values, doesn't have this service, compared to England, which doesn't make anywhere near the hoop-de-doo about family values, is going, of course, further. And the last point, the more big companies can be pressed by their employees to provide these kinds of benefits, which is why Aviva did it, the more likely it is, pretty soon, that Aviva itself will join with workers in making this the law that every employer has to provide this service. The minute, of course, Aviva joins the pressure to do that, it accomplishes two things. One, it takes away the competitive disadvantage of being the first company to do it, because everybody else has to also. And for the people pushing for these benefits, it's very helpful to have a deep-pocketed big corporation on their side, pushing for the law to provide it to everyone. Remarkable development in England, something Americans might want to think about as well. The second update for today brings me back to one of the biggest banks in the United States, Citibank. Like other major banks over the last several years, it has been fined, found guilty of committing legal acts that are against the law, or illegal acts rather, and ethically violating its customers' well-being. Well, here's another one, just for the record. Citibank was recently fined $6.5 million for abusing student loan recipients. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in Washington, D.C., announced that Citibank, which paid the fine, misled students about the details of their student loans, charged them inappropriate fees and fines as they tried to pay off the loan. $6.5 million is a trivial fine for a multi-billion-dollar company like Citibank. But it is not trivial in terms of what it means. Why? Because it's yet another example, as if we needed it, that a company pushing for profits will, sooner or later, press its employees to push up against the laws and the ethical norms of a decent society, and then, having pushed up against them, cross over them, cross the line. And here is Citibank, having been caught for money laundering, for shenanigans during the mortgage crisis, for helping to manipulate interest rates, for manipulating the foreign exchange rates. Well, there's another line of business, the student debts, and it's in there doing illegal or unethical things there too. Mixing the issue of providing educational finance with capitalist profits doesn't work well, does it? Third, and this is another example of the same basic idea. Starting on November 26, 2017, tobacco companies in the United States are required to publicize and pay for advertisements of a particular sort. I'm going to tell you about them in a minute. Why are they required to do this? Back in 1999, the Justice Department initiated a lawsuit against the tobacco companies. Remember, back in those days, they had been found guilty of deliberately and knowingly pumping up the nicotine and other chemicals in cigarettes, basically to get people addicted to them, because then they would buy a great many of them, and that would make money for the tobacco companies that produced them. Which tobacco companies? I'll give you the list so no one is mistaken here. Altria, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, Lorillard, and Philip Morris, the giants of that industry. Well, the companies fought in the courts, and it took from 1999 until 2006 to get a resolution of the suit. And as part of the settlement in 2006, the cigarette companies were required, at their own expense, to publish, quote unquote, corrective statements about what they had done and what the health risks and addictive nature of smoking were all about. But they resisted after this settlement too, and it took from 2006 to 2017, November 26 to be precise, for them finally to have to do what they were required to do as of the original settlement in 2006. If you have a lot of money and you can hire a lot of lawyers, that's how long you can keep raking in the money before you have to do what you're required to do when the court found you guilty of what the cigarette companies had done. So let me tell you what they're going to have to say. And I'm going to give you a sample, 2 sample ads that you will begin to see. Here's the first one. Quote, "More people die every year from smoking than murder, AIDS, suicide, drugs, car crashes, and alcohol combined." Let me let that sink in. Here's another one. Quote, "Cigarette companies intentionally designed cigarettes with enough nicotine to create and sustain addiction." The companies I named required by this settlement to run those ads starting November 26. What's the lesson here? It's a lesson that goes far beyond tobacco. This is not peculiar to cigarette companies. They just got caught, and partly was because they literally killed large numbers of people with the cancer and other consequences of an addiction to tobacco. They got caught. Others haven't yet, or have been, or will be. Why? Because the drive to maximize profit drove these companies intentionally to maximize their profit to subject millions of Americans to the deaths, injuries, loss of a family member, and all the other painful consequences of lung and other forms of cancer that were a direct consequence of their profit-making activities, from producing the cigarettes to enhancing the nicotine content to advertising, especially to children and young people, the joys and pleasures of smoking. You know the story. Now, people have been critical of these tobacco companies, but that's one thing that they don't take very far, which is why I want to make the following point. It isn't peculiar to the tobacco companies. This isn't particularly a story limited to cigarettes. This is a story, like with the Citibank story I started with, in which profit-making capitalist enterprises are driven to do socially devastating things as a regular part of business, and to stretch it out. Look at this behavior. You did it for years. You got caught. You got a suit against you from the Justice Department in 1999. You were found guilty and reached a settlement in 2006, and you stalled it off for the next 11 years so you could make even more money. There is no shame here. There is no regret. And there is something very wrong in a system that's organized like this. Before I go to the next item, I want to remind you that we maintain 2 websites that are there for your purposes, for your use. We fill them up with material that extends and elaborates what we do on this show. The first one is rdwolf with 2fs.com, and the second one is democracyatwork.info. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info. These websites are available to you at no charge whatsoever, 24/7. They allow you to communicate to us what you would like us to cover on the program, what you like and what you don't like. They allow you to follow with a click of the mouse, to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. They really are ways for you to partner with us, to extend the reach of the programs we produce and the materials we post on these websites. Do join us in making use of this material. Share it with other people that you know, that are friends, relatives, and co-workers. And for those of you that are listening to this program on the radio, if you would like to see it on television, let me urge you to visit patreon.com. That's Patreon, patreon.com/economic update for the television version of this program. The next update allows me to introduce to you, although I suspect you've already heard about this, the man who is now the richest man in the world, an American, named Jeff Bezos, or Bezos. I actually don't know exactly how he prefers it pronounced, but the spelling is B-E-Z-O-S. He's the chief executive officer of the Amazon Corporation, which I'm sure you know about. His personal wealth just went over this last month $100 billion. For one man to have $100 billion is the equivalent of saying that our society has achieved the dubious distinction of having an inequality that takes you back to the ancient pharaohs of Egypt in the distance between these rich people and the average person. Let me give you an idea, hard as it is to get your head around the notion of $100 billion. 14 out of the 50 states in the United States, 14 out of 50, have an annual total output of goods and services less than $100 billion. In other words, this one man disposes of more wealth than is created in any of these 14 states. Let me give you another example. There are 54 countries on the continent of Africa. Only 4 of them have a total output of goods and services, GDP it's called, larger than $100 billion. The other 50 are smaller economic entities than what Mr. Bezos, as a single individual, disposes of. What is this for? What kind of a commitment to democracy allows a mass of people to have difficulty meeting the basic requirements, food, clothing, and shelter, while one man has a quantity of wealth far exceeding anything anyone could imagine in the way of personal wealth? What is this for? Why would you have a society organized like this? The influence he can have with his $100 billion relative to 99.99999% of the rest of the people is outlandish. He's not one citizen among others. We're not equal, all of us. We are wildly unequal. He recently bought the Washington Post newspaper, the major newspaper in our capital city. He recently bought Whole Foods, the major organic food supermarket in the United States. He can do whatever he chooses. And that's, by the way, not with his personal wealth, but with his control of the Amazon Corporation. What notion of democracy can survive this kind of inequality? But the story is even richer. As we speak, there are strikes of Amazon employees in both Germany and Italy that have been going on. In both cases, thousands of the employees of Amazon are striking because of the unbearable working conditions. That's where the profits come from that feed this outlandish wealth. Luigi Giove, Secretary General of Italy's CGIL Trade Union Federation, says those that are striking Amazon are calling for shifts which are not exhausting. They've had physical exhaustion from the pace of work required. And he demands that Amazon redistribute its profits, sharing them in the larger society, precisely so we don't have the inequality that makes a mockery of democracy. This is an extraordinary moment in American history, producing this kind of wealth inequality, and I wanted to bring the issue to you. Finally, today, I want to talk about an attack on higher education here in the United States. It is something not given the kind of attention it ought to. Let's begin with the basic facts. Adjusted for inflation, that is, taking account how much money is spent on higher education and what the costs of doing that are, the United States as a whole spent $5.7 billion less on public higher education in 2016 than it did in 2008. So let me do that again. We spent almost $6 billion less in 2016 than we did as a country in 2008. Over the exact same period of time, an additional 800,000 students entered higher education in the United States. So we have almost 1 million more students and almost $6 billion less spent on it. What possible sense does this make? Let me remind you that a basic rule explained to almost all students in this country is that the United States' future as an economic society will depend more than ever on its position in the world economy, how well it does things, how well it produces goods and services, and so on. And one of the major determinants of how well we perform economically is the quantity and the quality of the students going to colleges and universities, which is true in every country. Where other countries are supporting, encouraging, expanding higher education, we are making it more costly for people, and we're spending less money on the quality, and it will show, and it will cost us. It's like a society shooting itself in the foot, and you have to wonder when a society does that. Let me give you an example just from one state so you get an idea. Arizona. Arizona has cut spending for higher education, public higher education, by 54% since 2008. The state now spends $3,500 less per year on every student than it did 8 years ago. That's a collapse of the funding, of the investment in the education of the young people of Arizona. And Arizona is not unique. It's a little worse than most of the other states, but it's not unique. Well then, why? The big question is, why is this happening? What's the rationale for all of this? Well, before I tell you, I'm going to read you a recent statements made by Donald Trump Jr., that is the son of the current president. He gave a speech in Texas. He was paid to give this speech $100,000. That was his fee for giving this speech. And the speech was a lot about college campuses in America. I am now going to quote from Donald Trump Jr.'s speech, as reported by the Washington Post, for those of you who are interested, on November 25th, 2017. Here we go. Ready? Here we go. Quote, "Hate speech is anything that says America is a good country, that our founders were great people, that we need borders. Hate speech is anything faithful to the moral teachings of the Bible." Why is Donald Trump Jr. saying this? Well, here's the explanation. Quote, "Many universities in America offer Americans a raw deal. We'll take $200,000 of your money. In exchange, this is all Donald Trump Jr. speaking. In exchange, we'll train your children to hate our country. We'll make them unemployable by teaching them courses in zombie studies, underwater basket weaving, and my personal favorite, tree climbing." End of quote. What's this about? Republicans have figured out that university and college students and people who have attended colleges and universities tend to be more often Democratic and or liberal than they are conservative and or Republican. It isn't much more complicated than that. Since these kinds of political, ideological considerations are now established in state legislatures where the Republican majorities control the bulk of states, you see the result. Defund the colleges and universities. Make them unable to deliver a decent education. And maybe then students will stop going and they won't afford it. And then there'll be less people going into an institution that produces, in the minds of Republicans, liberals and Democrats rather than conservatives and Republicans. The over-the-top idea that colleges train people to hate America. I'm a college teacher, spent my entire life in American colleges and universities, and have never seen anything to corroborate what Mr. Donald Trump Jr. says. But I do understand that we are in a society that is shooting itself in the foot in the way of education to satisfy an ideological agenda of one side of the political spectrum seeking to hold on to enough votes to keep itself in power. That's how empires and societies die, when the thing they do to hold on is the thing that undercuts their ability to hold on. We in the United States are at that point, and this story about education, like so many of the economic updates I bring to you, represent evidences for all of this kind of thing. That's why it's important to face them and to understand them. Thank you very much. We have come to the end of the first half of Economic Update. We will continue after a very short break, and I very much hope you'll stay with us for the second half of the program. Thank you, and stay tuned.